Girl, real talk. This whole "it's a new year, time to reinvent myself" trash is not the vibe for 2024. You can find someone who loves you for you, as you are. You don't need to read a stack of self-help books, only eat sad salads, or start meditating at 5 a.m. to be ready for dating. So yeah, my advice is to download Bumble and find someone who embraces you the way you are right now. Let me know how it goes.
Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, streaming January 25th, only on Netflix.
A note to listeners. The following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
The two killings in the Bronx, and that was in April of '77. And at this point now, we got the task force going. There were 7 of us, which eventually spread to 100 of us. If I asked them, with Christine Fruin, how did that come about? He explained the whole thing. How he actually followed them, and then they got into the car, and then there was a moment where he walked up to the car and he fired he fired 3 shots.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman.
Welcome back to The Killing Hour with Doc Bond. Once the NYPD realized that they had a serial killer on their hands, they quickly formed the Omega Task Force.
The task force was made up of the best in the NYPD. What started out as a few dozen quickly swelled into the 50s, and then eventually up to 100 officers working full-time on the Son of Sam murders.
Today, we're excited to speak to one of those task force members, Marlon Hopkins. Marlon spent his entire career in the NYPD, mostly as a detective. In 1977, he walked right into the true crime history books. Let's hear what he has to say. It's time to start The Killing Hour with Doc Bond.
Okay.
All righty.
Is Scott with you right there?
He is. Scott is here.
Hi, Scott. I haven't seen you in 5 years, and I recall, you asked me if I remember. Of course I remember. You sparked a lot of interest with me as well when we hooked up out in California.
Yeah, no, I that was a great experience. I was just going to say, I can't believe it's actually been almost 6 years. I think in June it'll be 6 years. It's amazing.
Well, I think the older we get, the faster the time goes,
Sad but true. It's great to connect.
Well, Marlon, thank you so much for being on the podcast. We really appreciate it. And Scott, Cindy, and I have been kind of diving into the world of serial killers, and we wanted to talk to you specifically about your experience with David Berkowitz and the Summer of Sam, which we remember vividly as young people living in the New York area. Wanted to start off with just a basic question. Let's talk a little bit about your background, how you became an NYPD detective, homicide detective, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was a young guy working in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I made a lot of arrests there. Some of them stood out. And one day, somebody approached me and says, I'll put you up before the board to see if you make detective. And that's what happened. They made me a detective, and it was the first time in 5 years that they gave out a gold shield. So, that was really outstanding for me at the time. When that happened, I was assigned to the Chief of Detective's office, where we did investigations citywide, making gun-buy arrests, all types of other major crimes that I got involved with. So now I'm building up my experience. And subsequently, I was transferred to the Manhattan North Homicide, and I stayed there for a year, and that was a corker because it was a homicide every day going on. And then I was transferred to the Queens Homicide, where we were targeting organized crime and all types of killings. Matter of fact, at that time, I went undercover for about 9 months before I was found out. So I'm back in the office doing the regular homicides, and then that came that day, January 30th, 1977, when Christine Fruin was killed, and I was assigned to the case. And from that point on, it got really interesting because a month later, we had Virginia Voskerichian, which was like a block and a half away from where Christine was killed. And also at the same time, our boss at the time was Captain Borelli. He made contact with the ballistics section, and we found that there was it wasn't an exact match, but it was leading in that direction because of the size of the caliber. And then from that point on, we heard about the people in the Bronx. That was the two killings in the Bronx, and that was in April of '77. And at this point now, we got the task force going. There was 7 of us, which eventually spread to like 100 of us. As we went along, it got even more interesting because other cases popped up. Basically, from the point of me being in the Bedford-Stuyvesant to the point where I'm involved in the task force and investigating these type of crimes, I was getting my experience in.
Do you remember your thoughts when you and the NYPD realized that there was a serial killer using this Bulldog 44 out there? Do you remember what your initial thoughts were?
Kinda, because you have to realize, before this happened, I got involved with organized crime and, so many types of murders and all types of weapons used and so on. When the idea of this 44 caliber, which is a very unusual caliber for anybody to have, and it showed up, Queens, and then the Bronx, and then at other places as well, it really piqued my interest because now I know we had something large to deal with. And that's when the news media came in because of the writings that Berkowitz had put out there, and one particular one to Borelli himself. Yeah, it was like, let's go get him.
At that time, when you were those first couple murders, did you think there was any correlation to each of them when you first investigated them? I mean, I would imagine there was when you did investigate them, you're like, there was no motive here. These people had no reason to be killed. Did you just feel it was random?
Well, at first, Christine, the thought was, the initial thought it had to be somebody close to her, the boyfriend or somebody that's jealous or whatever. So that kind of interest was there. But with the Virginia, when it came back, it was the same caliber. That's when it piqued our interest, and that's when the ballistic was checked and so on. So it was game on with a possible serial killer.
So the ballistics matched both bullets matched that gun.
Yeah, actually, they didn't match 100%, but there were striations on the lead itself. Gave a strong indication that it came from the same gun. Once that happened, that's when downtown got a whole big interest in this here, and that's when we started the task force, right there.
What was it like being on the task force? What were you thinking when that happened? Was it the first time that something like that had happened, or?
Well, that's a little different from what I was used to, with organized crime people. Now we're talking about civilians, and to be in a task force, to find somebody who was a possible serial killer, well, for me it was very exciting because I love that stuff. Detective work was my forte. I got to work with guys that were very seasoned detectives, and they came from all different commands throughout the city. So I got to meet them, work with them, and it was an exciting thing for me.
I imagine that, especially after the first letter to Captain Borelli, and the media got a hold of that, and he became the son of Sam, in the news media, that escalation probably had you and the other members of the team working around the clock, I would imagine. What was a typical day like being on the task force?
Well, normally as a homicide detective, you have set hours and, set partners that you work with. Now that's all changed. Actually, with Christine Pruitt, I worked around the clock. I didn't get home till like 2 days later. And I'm talking about constant going to the boyfriend and bringing him in for polygraphs and so on. So, it was like the interest was there for me, and I developed a couple of good partners, which I would have never experienced without this happening. And actually, we've become lifelong friends. Same with Borelli. I see Borelli periodically, and, we just kind of talk about the past a little bit and so on. You develop relationships. Not only with the police, but with people that you deal with. We had thousands of leads and call-ins from all types of people. And we had to work on each one of them. And I remember in the office, we had the office in the 109th precinct at the time in Flushing. And of course, the news media was all over. You had to work your way into the building to pass these people up. There were 3 bins. One was priority, one was a little less prioritized, and the other one was, forget about it, we'll catch up with it later. So every time I went in, I went to the priority. So each one I went on, they sounded like good leads at the time. Matter of fact, one of the leads led me to arrest somebody for 14 guns. I can give you instances which shocked even me at the time. It was like constant. It was not like you went in for 8 hours and you went home and you came back the next day. That's not how it worked. If there were leads that would draw you into a particular time of the day, I was there. If it was night, day, it doesn't matter. And we were working a lot of hours. And everybody wanted a piece of this killer.
Yeah, and what was the pressure like from above, obviously from your superiors and probably the mayor's office, and I would imagine at that time even above the mayor's office, to find Son of Sam and find this killer? How much was that, as you guys were investigating this, how much pressure were you guys feeling?
Well, I think they were great at the time. The mayor was great. The upper echelon of the police department was great because there were things that we needed, to use to lure this guy out. And one thing we did, we set up patrols. We closed down the bridges after each shooting. We had unmarked cars out there with some guys wearing wigs to look like a woman in the car in the Lovewood Lane area. And we also had a bulletproof car. And this was all, happening with the interest of the upper echelon to make this happen.
Did you have any, in the beginning when you first started, were there any other suspects? Did you have any major theories or leads that you really felt like could go somewhere?
A number of them, like I said, I went to the priority bin. So those were good, solid leads of people who suspected other people, and they gave their reasons why. And those leads came in from all types of people. Even police officers' partners, they were giving up. They were giving up business partners. They were giving up, and they explained why. So each one that we went out on, he says, well, this is a possibility. Everyone's a possibility. So you get all hyped up until you don't have any results with that. I'll give you one example of what happened. Joe Coffey. Joe Coffey was a sergeant then. He was in the task force. We did a lot of leads together. One day, we're in the office, and one came in about a guy that was living in the towers in Queens Boulevard. I think it was like a 14-story building. So we went up to see him. He invited us in. We had a conversation. Within 10 minutes, we realized this is not our guy. But the guy was a little unhinged. So the reason somebody turned him in was because of the fact they thought, it's a possibility. He's unhinged. He's in the area, whatever. Anyway, so we leave. And actually, that was towards the end of a day for us. We go home. As soon as I got in the door, I got a phone call. And it was asked of me, did you go up to this apartment, talk to this person? Yeah, we were there an hour ago. Oh, all right. He just did a header out of his building.
Wow.
I said, you what? Yeah. So it was crazy. Things like that happen.
You mentioned you were talking about possible mental illness or his motivations, and so I'd like to ask you a question related to that. As this thing escalated and he corresponded with Jimmy Breslin and sent more letters and talking about Papa Sam and his bloodlust and so forth, did you at the time think that you were dealing with somebody who was really mentally ill, or did you think he might have been toying with you and just playing games? Do you remember what your thinking was at that time?
Well, I think that's part of it. He did toy with us, with those letters and so on. Funny you should mention Jimmy Breslin, because we downed a couple of scotches together down in Flushing. And he was forget-it. Was always digging for information. Of course, never gave him information, but he was always, but a nice guy. I know he's not around anymore.
How often was he coming to you for information? Every day?
Oh, especially when we had the task force going at the 109, and he would be on Northern Boulevard. There was a Chinese restaurant with a bar, and that's where we would see him. It was by coincidence. It wasn't by design. He was a nice guy. We had some nice conversations, but he was always digging. And I would say, Jimmy, I can't tell you anything.
Yeah. What was the relationship like? With the press and the police department back then. Obviously, today it's a whole different ball game. And but describe to our listeners how law enforcement dealt with the press back then, and something like this.
Well, at that point, it started to get crazy when we had the Omega Task Force, because the press would show up at the building. Of course, they weren't allowed to come into the office. So I had to work my way through them. While I was doing this, I had one couple. They were from England. I heard their accent, and I had to talk to them. But this was like on the steps of the station house there. Once I heard the English, I said, "Where are you from?" And he says, "Well, we're from England." And he mentioned the magazine that they represent and so on. He says, "We're not the only one. We have people here from Italy, other countries." I said, "Wow, that was crazy." But as far as dealing with the media, it was okay. We had no problem. As you know, the media can take something and twist it the way they would like the public to respond to, and a lot of things were done, particularly with these sightings of Berkowitz. Each of the descriptions of him were totally different. They put it out there, and it excited a lot of people in the wrong way, I think. We got along with the press. There was no problem.
When Berkowitz was finally caught, I believe that you actually got to search his apartment and interrogate him personally. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what was that like?
First of all, when he was captured, he was brought to One Police Plaza, the chief of detective's office. And we all received the calls, and the ones that had the cases, like myself, went to that office, and we confronted Berkowitz, and it was a long table. He was at one end of the table, and we were lined up, and we were ready for questions. Now, the questions that were asked was things that did not show up in the news media, so the idea was not for him to work off news media information. So we did that. He was, I don't know how you can describe it, but he was so much stoic. He was like, he gave information which nobody knew about, but we knew about it. So we knew we had the right person, and then he in detail with each detective, with their cases, gave information willingly, openly, and without hesitation. So after that 3 hours of doing this with him, Dick Conlon and myself and my partner at the time, Erwin Jacobson, we went to the apartment. I think for me, that's when the investigation really started, because we walked into that apartment and it was in disarray. There was a lot of papers on the floor. There was a lot of pornography. There was writings on the wall, and particularly around the bed area where he had a hole in the wall, which we found out he was talking through, deranged mind, thought that there was somebody inside that hole, and so on. And also, I recovered some bullets, 44 caliber bullets and things like that. But it was, like I said, it was a start for me to really get into this stuff. And I went to speak to Sam Carr and the people that he affected in the area. Went to the post office where he had worked, and this is all in one morning now. When I went into the post office, told them who we were, and at that point, it hit the papers who it was. So they knew in the post office that he was arrested for being the son of Sam. And I said, well, what do you think? What was his routine? Well, he worked inside, and every day the newspaper would come in. He'd look at the newspaper, and everybody would be hanging around having coffee, and he would be saying, "Look at that son of a bitch! You ought to be caught." It was crazy.
Not only was he reading the paper about himself, he was stoking the fires about him being. That's hilarious.
I just wanted to ask about Sam Carr. That's a big part of the legend that somehow his neighbor Sam Carr and his Labrador Retriever Harvey were instructing Berkowitz to kill on their behalf. So two questions. I mean, did Sam Carr have much even to say about Berkowitz, and in terms of any sort of real relationship or interaction? And then the second part of the question is, did you buy that story about the demonic possession and so forth?
All right, let's get back to Sam Carr, where I spoke to him. I spoke to his daughter, Wheat Carr. From that, we developed some information what Berkowitz had done through his sight from his apartment to their building, and him firing shots there. So eventually we went down and we took a look at the building, and sure enough, there was bullet holes in the doorway where he had shot. My contact with the cars was mainly with her, because she was a dispatcher there, and for the PD, and she was able to fill in a little bit more about the actions of Berkowitz at the time. But as far as
the fact that legend has it, and it's been, of course, the story has been spun so many different ways. But one of the interpretations is that Berkowitz thought Sam Carr was the devil or a demon, and was using his dog Harvey to instruct Berkowitz to kill. And did you? That's my question is, did you buy that, or was that just sort of fantasy or mythology?
Well, first of all, my 3 hours with Berkowitz, I came to a conclusion already. Not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a person that can jump into your mind, but my experience dealing with people, interrogations or whatever, I established in my own head at the time that this fellow's crazy. This fellow here concocted stories through bizarre ways of reaching out to people. And as far as Sam Carr, I think they were just innocent bystanders, so to speak. They had nothing to do with this man other than the actions of his part against them. Every time the newspaper would come out, there was always a little twist to it all the time about maybe a cult involved. So it came out enough about the cult that we actually went to several locations where we found out they were doing some rituals. They like to kill the chickens and hang them from the trees and draw the blood and all kinds of stuff. And, that was kind of interesting, actually. But then after he was arrested, we followed up with some other leads, because the leads were still coming in, and about the cult. And I think people were just leaning on the fact that news media says there's a cult. They believe it, Anyway, so we investigated a few of those, and there was no connection whatsoever to cult. And I know people tried to establish that while he's in prison, just to keep the ball rolling, with him.
I absolutely agree with you, Marlon. There was a Netflix series, a year or so ago, that is trying to perpetuate this notion that he was part of a killing cult. And I don't believe it. I never did believe it. In fact, when I interviewed Berkowitz in prison a few years ago, and he told me emphatically he acted alone. But yet, to this very day, there are people who maintain and will, fight to the end that he was part of a group and, didn't act alone.
That's what I think media does. I mean, they have their own reasons for keeping something like this going. It's just like the other, situations throughout the country, serial killers. Now, why would Berkowitz only killing, I shouldn't say that, but I will say, only killed 6, where other serial killers have killed dozens. And the Son of Sam comes back all the time. And it's the interest of people. So I'm trying to figure out, why are people interested? And I come up with this conclusion. If you turn on the TV, you read the newspaper, what do we see today? Everything is all violence. It's about homicides. It's an excitement that people actually want to hear and somehow experience it. So the interest is there because of the want for listening to and hearing about violence. And of course, Berkowitz is well known, I think, throughout the country. And, it's a favorite subject.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it was at the time, New York, and still is, the kind of center of the world, and it was also the center of media at the time, that he got so much airplay. And because we do murders all the time, just covering them around the country in small towns and stuff, and there's something similar that would happen like in Oklahoma at that time, wouldn't have gotten the same play as it did if it was in New York City area. So I think that probably helped it. I mean, we even talked about it on with Doc Bond and covering the BTK, and how BTK in Kansas was jealous of the coverage that Son of Sam was getting. And it kind of resurrected some of the stuff that he was doing, because he wanted to kind of step up his game. So I think that played a big part of it, is that David Berkowitz was in the media machine of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely true. And BTK, if he had been doing exactly the same thing, but in New York, then his criminal star, if you will, would have been, even brighter. I think also, in addition to the fact that this took place in the media capital of the world, some of the specifics of the case, the satanic aspect of it, killing allegedly on behalf of Satan, and also the times, in many ways, the 1970s, I was in New York in the 1970s, and it was it's kind of a scary place. Crime was high, and there was a lot of fear in the city. And then this seeming madman emerges out of nowhere and takes the city by storm for an entire summer, the summer of Sam, and it just made for an incredible story.
Yeah, actually, during the 70s, that was the city was in an unrest position, because of the groups that were out there. If you recall, the Black Panthers and the Puerto Rican groups, organized crime killings. There was so much going on. And I have to say this, one reason, Elvis Presley was always a favorite of mine. And he passes away in August 17th, 1977. And that's a day that lives with me, because I tried to emulate him when I was a teenager with my blue suede shoes. I go back to the 70s as a lot of unrest, the killings that took place, just with organized crime alone. I mean, it was like within the district that I worked, and like I said, I went undercover for a while. We had, within 1 year, 30 deaths attributed, like the Gambino family, for one. That was one hell of a time.
Scary times. And I didn't realize that. So if my math is right, Berkowitz was caught 1 week before Elvis died.
Yeah. Wow.
I never made that connection. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Matter of fact, I'm trying to remember the name. It was Florence's Tavern. That was downtown Manhattan. We had the bombing there. Scott, do you remember that at all?
Vaguely, yeah, I do.
Yeah, that was where the Puerto Rican group, went in and bombed and some people got killed there. So we had that on top of the Black Panthers going out committing robberies and actually shooting police and so on. You put this all together with the interest that went into the newspaper at the time. It was a situation that it wasn't like behind closed doors. Now everybody was experiencing this stuff. So everybody in New York experienced a lot of bad stuff during that time.
Absolutely. And I mean, I recall I moved to New York from the Midwest in the late 70s. And so I was there and at that time there was this fear of even going to Times Square. I mean, you were afraid to go to Times Square because you heard of all these stories of murders and robberies and and rapes and so forth. So you've got to, if a terrain, if you will, or an environment that's already fraught with fear, and then when you put Berkowitz on top of it, I mean, I think that's a big part of the reason that the city and the country just became so riveted with this story.
1,000 things happened, at least with me, during that time. I mean, I have some really good memories of stuff that I did, talking to people, and I made some arrests during that time as well. That got in the way of, continuing with an investigation, but that was only short-lived. The conflict that was going on with all these here groups that were, committing. Oh, as far as, like me right now, yeah, I still carry a gun. I carry the gun all the time. But the only time I carry it is when I go into the city. Up until 2 years ago, I carry my gun all the time now because crime has increased dramatically. I don't care what the mayor says. I don't care what the governor says. It's increased dramatically. And there's a lot of guns on the street. When I was making gun buys, it was a big thing. I get somebody with about 4 or 5 guns, and it was a good arrest, right? Today, if you look, you'll see gun arrests where they come up with 30, 40 guns. And all these young kids out in the street, they're all carrying. So it's not a safe place. I think it's caused me to be aware of my surroundings more so than ever. I gauge people by watching them. and so on.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think everybody is more situationally aware, especially in the bigger cities. I mean, we live in Los Angeles. We don't go down there that much anymore. We live in the suburbs, but we were very cognizant of our surroundings. I want to go back to a little bit earlier. Can you kind of take us through the kind of days leading up to the arrest of David Berkowitz, son of Sam, and what your team, the task force, was focusing in on, and what were some of the key aspects of finding him and determining whether or not he was a potential suspect where you had to arrest him?
The days before, I mean, we were down to, I got to put my thinking cap on here.
It's okay.
And of course, Stacy Moskowitz being the last one. So between Stacy Moskowitz, I would probably say during Sirianni and when Carl De Niro got shot, it was like, matter of fact, I'll tell you what happened. We're in the office one day, or one evening, and this call came in that there was a shooting and the victim went to the hospital. So, of course, it piqued their interest, and I went to the hospital, looked at him, and he was shot in the head. And he had this long hair, looked like a hippie. The first thoughts were, it was a jealousy thing and whatever. But then, we discounted it, and we eventually left. Eventually, when I saw Carl, I told him, I said, I was at the hospital when you were shot. He said, you were? I said, yeah, I was talking to you. You responded to some questions. He said, I was out of it. But actually, at that time, he was shot by Berkowitz. So things that happened between, the last couple of homicides, things got very intense with patrols. The focus at the time also was the disco on Northern Boulevard, where actually I was about, I'm going to say maybe a quarter of a mile away from the disco in an unmarked car when it happened. When it did happen, and then we realized that this was the son of Sam, of course, I got angry with myself because I was there, and I could have, but it didn't happen. But the emphasis right then and there was to set up traps for him by closing the bridges when something happens, going around with unmarked cars, with detectives wearing wigs look like females. We did all kinds of stuff to come up with this guy, to capture him. So that was the emphasis right there, to just to flood the area, lock him in. That didn't happen until they get.
Girl, real talk. This whole "it's a new year, time to reinvent myself" trash is not the vibe for 2024. You can find someone who loves you for you, as you are. You don't need to read a stack of self-help books, only eat sad salads, or start meditating at 5 a.m. to be ready for dating. So yeah, my advice is to download Bumble and find someone who embraces you the way you are right now. Let me know how it goes.
Join me, 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty, on my podcast, My Life of Crime, as I take on true crime investigations like no other. This season, I'm looking into the labyrinth of crime and secrets within families. I'm cutting straight to the evidence and talking to the people directly involved, including investigators and the families of victims. Listen to My Life of Crime with Erin Moriarty wherever you get your podcasts.
That great day with Moskowitz, where this cop gave a summons, that was phenomenal. I mean, it really comes down to sometimes it's just plain old police work, and the things happen. So at the time, would have loved to have had their hands on him.
It was a parking ticket, right? Wasn't it? Wasn't it a citation?
Yeah, it was a parking ticket, and then the woman who was walking her dog at the time brought that out to somebody, and eventually that got into our office, and it says, oh, Jesus, that's too close, for that type of car, because it showed up a registration in Yonkers. What is the Yonkers car doing in Brooklyn? So it sparked a little interest, and that's why the two detectives went up to Yonkers, and that's where the fun began, because, they looked in the car, and there was the butt of a rifle and some papers which matched the writings of the Berkowitz when he communicated, with the news meeting and so on. And that was a very exciting moment for those two guys.
I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great time.
When they did discover that information, how much of a lid was kept on it internally in the police department to kind of control the information? Because you had been searching for this guy for such a long time. And what was because I know, I mean, we have friends in the police force all the time, is when that's like it's almost like a double-edged sword. Like we're close, but we don't have him yet. We think it's him, but we got to verify.
Yeah, well, that was kind of short-lived. I mean, from the time that, they went up and they saw the car and they realized that this is him, okay, without even seeing him, but they realized it was him. And that's when they called for, more of a backup, so to speak, to get a warrant for the apartment as well. As far as, it was like an explosion, filtered out into the whole city. Everybody knew about it the next day. Everybody. And it was like, and I know a lot of us are saying, well, geez, I wish it was me, but that's okay. It's still a brother detective who made the arrest, and that was great.
If we could, I'd like to go back just for a second to when you were actually sitting there across the table from him, and he was not a very imposing or impressive-looking guy, and not particularly large in stature either. How did the reality match what you might have anticipated finding, with the Son of Sam? Was it similar, or was it very different than what you had expected?
That's a good question. I would probably say, did he fit somebody that would be a serial? How do you put something on somebody that you don't know about, and then you see him and you're told that he's a serial killer, and you don't expect that beforehand? With Berkowitz, he looked like a regular guy, crazy, but he was a regular guy. And our conversations with him at that time, I wrote down my questions and responses that I got, and I still have it today. And they were like very much to the point. If I asked him, like with Christine Fruin, how did that come about? He explained the whole thing. How he actually followed them, and then they got into the car. And then, there was a moment where he walked up to the car and he fired and he fired 3 shots. Now, this wasn't that wasn't divulged at the time, but he divulged that now, the 3 shots. It was like talking to somebody about a regular day at the post office. Yeah. It was a regular day at work, so.
Very unemotional and detached.
Yes, exactly.
And it's not uncommon with these characters. So you didn't get a sense that, once he was apprehended, he dropped the facade. You didn't get a sense that he was trying to play games or play cat and mouse with you. He was pretty straightforward.
Oh yeah, pretty straightforward. He was willing to talk. He was willing to explain in detail, which he did. He was given that opportunity for 3 hours, and he spelled out everything. Like I said, he had that. The only thing that stood out to me was like that stoic look. He was very compliant in detail. Like he was, like nothing ever happened. He wasn't a killer. He's listen. I've had homicides where, I sit down and because I did a lot of interrogations, and at the end of the interrogation, things happen. Either people cry, or they're afraid, or there's some sort of an emotional response. With him, nothing.
Just no empathy at all.
Nope.
Question for you in relation to what Scott was asking about what you saw in David Berkowitz, as opposed to what you said you really couldn't anticipate what he would look like because you didn't have the information during the investigation. Right. When you started getting all this, he started writing all these, the letters and stuff like that. Did you guys have any kind of mock-up profile on who you thought he was and what type of person he was?
Not really. We had a lot of different descriptions. As you know, the artist put some stuff together from witnesses that saw certain things. And, let's go back to Christine Fruin, and Voskerichian. There were people there who saw something, but they couldn't put him in the spot. But with Voskerichian, Berkowitz actually ran into this guy on the street and bumped into him. Well, we had a description from him, but it was kind of vague. Any descriptions that were given were vague, and it's when you have an artist and the artist asks you, well, what kind of nose, that wasn't, available. But what you did have is like, well, what he was wearing a hat. He was maybe about 5'8", 6 foot. Those are very vague descriptions to work with.
And this case really became a fundamental part of the way the FBI developed their behavioral science department and the way they go about profiling. So it was really, profiling as we know it today was really in its very rudimentary stages, and Berkowitz in many ways was part of the actual creation of that.
You're right. I mean, a lot of things have happened since the 70s to now in law enforcement that I wish I had the tools then what we have today. It's like DNA, for one, and, like to go to a crime scene and, where they clean up the blood. Today, they had that wherewithal to show that there was a blood and then get a DNA from that. To me, I think that's great, and I wish I had that back in those days.
You bring up a really super point, Marlon. I'm glad you did. I have a theory which it's really impossible to prove or disprove because you can't prove what didn't happen. But one thing we do know is that the number of serial killers and serial killings are dramatically down today from the 1970s and 1980s. And I believe that one of the reasons that is the case is, as you said, technology, advancements in forensics, DNA. And I think that there's probably a lot of these individuals who are being caught after their first killing before they even go on to become serial killers. That's a theory of mine. What do you think about that?
Wow. Well, that's something that's a learned thing, with police departments and the FBI and so on. You know what gets me, though, is that there are a number of serial killers out there. There's probably hundreds. And I find that a lot of them, when they're found out years later, they've already buried the evidence. And as a matter of fact, there was one case last year I remember reading about where it was like 30 years later, and he had about 3 dozen girls that he killed in about 3 states. And each one of them that he killed, he buried each one of them. He lived in a community where nobody suspected him. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that does happen in the United States.
And of course, the DNA was the way they got the Golden State Killer. And even BTK, they matched his daughter's DNA to his crime scene DNA, and that's the way they finally, closed that case as well.
Yeah, actually, when I retired from the police department, I became a private detective, and I did that for 23 years. And you named the type of situation. I had over 800 cases, and there was a couple in there where it was a boyfriend-girlfriend thing, and there was some semen on a sheet, and it was like, what can we do with this? And I says, well, we can do a DNA. That's when DNA started to come out, and that was like in the early 80s. So I submitted it to a lab at the time, and it actually took 3 months before I got the results on it. And today, it's like, it's no big thing,
Yeah, and if you watch TV, it happens in 60 minutes or less.
Oh, it's got it.
Yeah, here's a question that it's I'm sure you've been asked this before, but I think it's an important one. And you were so centrally involved in this Son of Sam task force and the investigation and ultimately the apprehension. How did that affect your career afterwards?
Well, my status got up. I was promoted again. It put me in a situation. Don't forget, I was a young guy then, and I'm working in an office with older detectives. And actually, I had to make my bones with these guys before they accepted me, and which I did. I solved homicides and so on. So when I, got second grade out of this, which at that time, they weren't giving out too many. I think there was about 40 in the whole city, second grade. So, it was like, it affected me. This may sound stupid, but if I had to pick a vacation, I was on top of the list. If I had to take a day off, I was on top of the list. If I had to leave for whatever reason, I was on top of the list. So that status that I received at that time helped me that way. Mm-hmm. Aside from also getting a little bump in my salary.
Marlon, I have a
Very
question.
nice.
I was a young child at the time when this happened, and grew up in New York, and we were terrified. Of course, my parents were, constantly talking about it. Everybody was talking about it. I'm just curious, like as a young detective, and you were thrust into this environment with this serial killer running around. How did you feel like about that? I mean, I think for me, it's like a lot of people were just terrified to go into the city, to just even be outside. I'm just curious, as a young detective, what your thoughts were at the time when this was happening.
Well, as a young detective, as a young police officer, I was in a situation where, like I said, I worked in Bed-Stuy, and there was always crime going on, and so I had, grassroots of, dealing with people and bad people. I was hospitalized actually a few times, in the course of me working there. The idea that for me going from that point of making street arrests and dealing with violent people and so on. Oh, by the way, during the 70s when we were having the riots, I had a radio car which they turned over on me. And I had to call a 1013, which, assist patrolman at the time. So all these things, build up. And then when I became a detective, I was introduced to a different world. The city of New York was my ballgame, where I went out and I made arrests, and and these were substantial arrests that I made, and that's what caused me for them to put me into homicide. But yeah, it was like all these things that took place to the point where, to the Son of Sam, I had a lot of experience dealing with people. Interrogations, how to talk to people, how to elicit information. So when the time came for this, I'm ready. Game on. So it's not like, well, I don't know what to do, or I'm afraid to do it. No, that wasn't the case.
I guess the last question, and thank you for all your time, is after David Berkowitz was charged and he was convicted and put in prison, he's now a born-again Christian and now serves God in prison. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, my opinion was, first of all, he never had religion in his life, okay? Now he's in an institution where he's confined, he's not getting out, he's going to be there the rest of his life, and he's with some really bad people. Matter of fact, one of the persons cut his throat. As you know, how do you get around that? And to keep your status going of who you are, your identity, become a person that's going to give religious information to the inmates where they want to accept that. So he's put himself in a good position to continue his
demigod status as a notorious killer, but he's wrapped in a Christian blanket.
Yeah, it's just a different venue for him to have that status going, to have that people coming to him, and they're in there, so they come to him. He's a bad guy, okay, yeah, but he can tell you about God. I have my own thoughts on that, but I think that's all it is. It's just to continue his notoriety and status. That's all.
So you think that he's essentially just this is Son of Sam 2.0. He's reinvented himself in prison to keep the limelight on.
Oh, sure, definitely. Especially when people come to see him, and I guarantee you that the rest of the inmates there know that he's being interviewed, he's being spoken to. Now, this is a man of distinction here, and they look up to him. So it's easy for him to bring God into the equation.
It's very interesting that you say that, because I don't know if you remember, Marlon, but I corresponded with Berkowitz for several years, and I actually went to visit him at his invitation when he was still at Sullivan Correctional Facility. And his demeanor now is, I mean, if you can envision a backyard gnome with rosy cheeks and a plump little guy. That's the way David Berkowitz looks today. And we sat there in the cafeteria talking for several hours. And you're exactly right. The other inmates would come by and they'd say, Brother Dave, how are you? So I think, it's absolutely true. I think he has created this sort of new persona that works for him in his environment where he will never leave, as you said.
You are so right. I believe that too.
Why do you think, Marlon, that Berkowitz became such an iconic villain in popular culture so many years later? Why do you think people are so fascinated with this?
Well, the young people today don't know the story, in detail, but they do know, maybe from old film clips or whatever, what he did to the city. He put the city in fear. That word itself can excite people, to want to know more about him. It was like, you remember where young women, girls would have to, dye their hair, cut their hair. They would stay away from, places where they would, lovers' lanes and things like that. That's fear. And he promoted a lot of fear. And like I say, he shot so many people, he killed 6, but there's other serial killers out there that killed a lot more. So why does he get all the attention? It was the fear that he created in a city of New York. That's what it was, and that's what it is. They still want to know about him.
And he, by the way, when I spoke to Berkowitz, in person, one-on-one, he told me that he was very aware at the time that he was terrorizing the city of New York, and he really got off on that. He loved it. He loved seeing the headline, Son of Sam strikes again, and he said that fear was absolutely what he was trying to accomplish with the city of New York.
Well, he accomplished it. That's for sure. It's amazing, listen, all the homicides that I've dealt with, and solved and whatever, I think that this one, of course, it stands out most not because of how a person got killed, who got killed, or whatever. It's what transfers over to the people around them. And in this case, it's the city of New York. And if it's a regular homicide, it's just family. It's a closed case where some X amount of people. That's it. But this guy here, everybody knew, and he created that fear.
Next time on Partners in True Crime.
I mean, he wouldn't seem to have the same personality traits as a lot of the serial killers, but the more we looked into it, the more we found that he actually did have some of them.
We have an exciting announcement for all of our listeners. Doc Bond is taking his serial killer expertise on the road this spring in a live theater event.
To purchase tickets to Doc Bond's show, The Psychology of Serial Killers and Why They Captivate Us, go to www.psychologyofserialkillers.com. That's www.psychologyofserialkillers.com. Go see Doc Bond and get the real story on what goes on in these notorious killers' minds.
All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.